Salutation, my esteemed students of siege warfare. Today's topic is the product of a scandalous romance between the Trebuchet and the catapult. It is their secret love child after their midnight rendezvous behind the siege tower. First, we have the Trebuchet. Trebuchets were originally a man-powered machine. It was a bonding experience between soldiers. A couple of sweaty dudes all yanking on ropes together to fling their projectiles. Then some lazy soldier thought, what if we just use the physics engine of the game? And thus, the venerable counterweight Trebuchet was born. On the other hand, operating in a world all its own, the catapult used finicky torsion springs to fling their payloads. These torsion springs were made out of animal sinews. They were difficult to source, expensive to maintain, and hard to get spun up to their proper strength. In addition to all that, they weren't even strong enough to fling their heavier payloads. These shortcomings resulted in the catapult being the ugly duckling when compared to the Trebuchet. But this ugly duckling never grew up to be beautiful. And this is where their child enters the picture. The ironarm. The ironarm is basically some drunk medieval engineer thinking, what if we addressed some of the problems, not all of them, and then introduce some brand new problems? And that medieval engineer, in his drunken stupor, sketched up this beautiful piece of machinery. The name ironarm literally means one arm in German. This just goes to show the Germans are doing their normal work, making overly complicated machines that are too difficult to build and kind of useless, rather than being creative and naming it something cool. In the spirit of German engineering to make it more complicated and weird, this bad boy features a 2-for-1 projectile slot. Not only is it equipped with the classic wooden spoon for flinging rocks, it is equipped with the doubly classic sling for flinging rocks. This gives you a 2-for-1 projectile special every time you discharge it. Another head-scratching choice this engineer made was getting rid of the counterweight up front. Instead of a super simple counterweight letting the physics engine work, they attached 2 metal springs or wooden boards to work as springs. This gave it all the benefits of being more complicated than a counterweight, less complicated than a torsion spring, but weaker than a counterweight. I'm not completely sold on the idea of using metal springs or wooden boards as your power system. At the very least, using these springs made it more transportable than your large trebuchets. It was easier than a catapult to transport because you didn't need to tend to the sinews. In the same vein of being easy to transport, it was a less complicated machine. This meant you didn't need all those egghead engineers to assemble it once you got to the siege camp. And this is the point I wish I could give you a historical example of the machine, but my sources are extremely limited. When it comes to sources, it literally only occupies about half a page in a book, specifically about siege weapons. The other source I found was a Google Doc post translated from Russian. That is what I had to work with. Another scrap I had to work with was a post on the Slingshot channel forum saying that Jorgsparv had built one of these, but I couldn't find any proof of it. If you have proof of him building one of these, I would love to see it. Despite the limited sources, let's go over some pros and cons. The pros list is kind of small. We already kind of touched on one of the pros, but no need for those sinews. They were hard to source, difficult to maintain, and they broke, didn't like being wet. Despite how much I love torsion catapults, they really aren't worth their weight. Another pro, we could say, is the 2-for-1 projectile system. In the sources, I couldn't find any reason why this would be good, other than you're flinging 2 rocks, it has to be good. It's more than one. We'll just give it a freebie. It needs all the help it can get. The ironarm might be shooting a smaller payload than a trebuchet, but it had a faster rate of fire. With a faster rate of fire and 2 projectiles, this meant it was potentially extremely effective against foot soldiers. I say potentially because we'll touch on that later. And to wrap up the pros, it was a simple machine. It could be assembled by your average soldier. It didn't need an engineer. It didn't need some mathematician. It didn't need Archimedes himself to be there to build it. And moving over to the con side, this thing was probably weak. In modern times, we have tons of available spring steel. That means we could get really powerful springs that we could attach to our ironarms. In medieval times, expensive steel like that wouldn't be cheap. It wouldn't be readily available. That means they had to resort to wooden arms. Now you're basically just using a bow and arrow laying flat, trying to fling a rock at the end of a spoon. Tell me how that's a good idea. And its major drawback was the same as a student graduating with an outdated degree. The ironarm was conceived when the cannon had already proved to be the mainstay on the siege battlefield. The original drawings for the ironarm come from the 15th or 16th century. This is well into the life of the cannon proving its salt. Any military that was serious about conquering wasn't going to use stone throwers anymore. They're going to be using cannons. The ironarm was likely just a forgotten concept, a siege weapon that existed mostly in the imagination of some weapons enthusiast who was still clinging on to the glory days of rock throwing. In my final thoughts, this hybrid of a weapon is just another page in the book of human imagination figuring out ways to unalive one another. And that's where this weapon lives, in the pages of imagination. It never actually saw the use on a battlefield that we know of. Until now. Well, it's not gonna see a battlefield. It's gonna see a field though, and it's probably gonna throw a couple things. But that's right, I'm gonna be building one of these suckers. So stay tuned to see what happens when a fake history professor with too much time on his hands builds a weapon that never actually existed. What could possibly go wrong? And with that, I will see you later. Make sure to siege the day and siege the like button. People that watch this video will probably know York's barf.
Cool.
Because he's... And it was very funny. It was like, I found a post on it in the Slingshot channel forum, and they're like, yeah, he's already built one of these. And I was scouring the internet for it, and I couldn't find it. Okay.
That's blooper content.
A blooper.
Or like end of video content.